So thanks everyone for coming tonight. This is one of several events that we're hosting this week around the gender tech event that's happening next weekend. There are a lot of people in town, and so we're trying to make the most of it by bringing people to come and discuss digital rights issues. Afef Abrougui is one of the people who is here, and we're going to be hearing from her in a second. Tonight's event is called SmartPhone Diaries, Incentivizing Mobile Operators to Protect Your Digital Rights. And this event is basically the culmination of several months, maybe close to a year's worth of research now, on mobile telecom operators in the Arab region and whether or not they have publicly disclose their terms of service or privacy policies, and just generally what some of our private sector players in the digital rights space are doing to protect our digital rights. This is a field that's new around the world in terms of holding technology and telecom companies to account for protecting rights and respecting rights. We've been working with Ranking Digital Rights, which is a project led by Rebecca Mackinnon, who will also be with us today, to develop and adapt the methodology that they've been using for the Corporate Accountability Index, which is a global ranking of, I think, 22 companies in the tech and telecom space. Looking at how we can leverage this kind of research for advocacy, not directed at governments this time, but directed at companies, because they are sort of de facto designing and defining what space we have in the online realm. So I'll just say a little bit about our panelists today, and then I will turn the rest of the evening over. So, as you know, SMEX is, hi Rebecca, can you see us? We just started, I just gave sort of a brief introduction. We're on Jitsi and we're recording this. We're probably going to share, the live stream link in case anybody wanted to join. And we're hoping that our internet connection holds as we do so. So great to see you, cool. So I was just gonna say that for those of you who don't know, SMEX is a Beirut-based media development and digital rights organization. We work to advance self-regulating information societies in Middle East and North Africa. Our mission is to defend digital rights, promote open culture and local content, and encourage critical engagement with digital technologies, media, and networks through research, knowledge building, and sharing and advocacy. And Ranking Digital Rights, where Rebecca Mackinnon will be representing today, and which we'll talk about a lot in terms of the methodology that we use, is working with an international community of researchers to set global standards for how internet, mobile, and telecommunications companies should respect freedom of expression and privacy. The 2017 Corporate Accountability Index ranked 22 of the world's most powerful such companies on their disclosed commitments and policies that affect users' freedom of expression and privacy. And in the event description on Facebook, you can see a link. We'll also pull up the page for you a little bit later. We can do it right now. Give you just a quick look. If you go to rankingdigitalrights.org, you can read more about the project. And here today is going to start our conversation is Afef Abrougui. She is a Netherlands-based and Tunisian journalist and research fellow at SMEX on the Mobilize for Rights project, or what we've been calling the Mobilize for Rights project, investigating terms of service and privacy policies at mobile telecom operators in the Arab region. She is also an editor at Global Voices and conducts research for the Ranking Digital Rights Corporate Accountability Index. She has an MA in Media Studies from the University of Amsterdam, where she wrote her thesis on content removal policies and practices at commercial social media platforms. And Rebecca Mackinnon is also with us, and in addition to founding and directing the Ranking Digital Rights program, Rebecca is co-founder of the citizen media network Global Voices and author of Consent of the Networked, The Worldwide Struggle for Internet Freedom. Highly recommend it. She is on the board of directors of the Committee to Protect Journalists and was a founding board member of the Global Network Initiative, which SMEX has just become a member of. So we can talk more about that too, which we're very excited. So prior to becoming an advocate for online rights, she worked for CNN as a correspondent and bureau chief in Beijing and Tokyo in the early 90s and early noughts, or I don't know how we say that these days, but so awesome. So Afef, I'm going to pass the microphone to you. I'm going to put your presentation up on screen, and I would love for you to sort of introduce the project that we've been working on together, talk about the methodology and some of your findings, and then later we'll bring Rebecca in to sort of talk about the Ranking Digital Rights and the Corporate Accountability Index overall. And also, what we're really interested in learning from you, Rebecca, is the localization projects. And other than our region, what other kinds of insights have you seen and have the other researchers seen? And then sort of we thought at the end of the program we could just kind of strategize a bit or brainstorm a bit about ways that we can use these data sets to develop some advocacy plans to advocate for disclosure, first of all, of these kinds of policies, and then, second of all, to actually encourage these companies to actually include the language that we'd like to see in the policies themselves. So, without further ado, Afef.
Thank you, Jessica. So, as Jessica mentioned, this is basically a project of more than a year, I think. And when we started, basically we didn't really know what we're going to end up with, or we had like a few ideas about how we were going to do this. At first, we were thinking about like comparing the subsidiaries of operators already ranked by digital rights, subsidiaries that are based in the Arab region. But then we actually decided not to take that route because not so many or not enough operators publish terms of service, and that would not actually make a comparative approach possible. Our research actually focuses on mobile operators. I mean, unlike ranking digital rights, which focuses on different telecommunication companies and internet companies, we decided to focus on mobile operators because increasingly in the region, more and more users are mainly accessing the internet through mobile networks. And the research is basically divided into two parts. The first part is basically a mapping of the terms of service and the disclosures of the mobile operators that are based in the region. Well, these are 66 mobile telecom operators that are based in the Arab region. We did sort of disclosure inventory of their publicly available policies, and these include terms of service and privacy policies. The second phase is basically an evaluation or an assessment of the free speech policies and commitments of the companies that at least publish terms of service, and we assessed these policies uses 5 indicators, 5 RDR, Corporate Accountability Index indicators, or I think it's actually 4, I think I mistyped this. It's actually 4 indicators. We use them to assess these policies, to assess these policies, and well, the Corporate Accountability Index actually has, I think, 39 indicators. I think Rebecca can correct me later if I'm wrong. But we decided to only use 4 indicators because simply companies do not publish enough information, or these terms of service are not do not have like enough information for us to use all of these indicators. Yeah. So these are, for the first part of the research, these are the indicators that we adapted from the ranking digital rights. We look into whether a company publishes terms of service privacy policy and whether a company has publicly available human rights policy where it makes or where it commits to uphold users' freedom of expression rights and privacy rights. And we also look into whether a company publishes transparency reports or publishes data about government requests for content or service restrictions or and user data. Next slide. And for the first part of the research, we basically, our findings, out of 66 companies, only 14 published terms of service and only 7 published privacy policies. And basically we concluded that mobile telecom operators in the region do not keep their users informed about their policies and commitments. These companies actually have hundreds of millions of users, and in some markets they are like they are the only mobile telecom provider or one of two, and as a result, tens of millions of users actually remain in the dark about these policies. Also, one of our findings is the inconsistency between how companies behave or the information that companies publish or make available to their users in their home markets, and the information that and the lack of information at a subsidiary level, and this applies to both EU-based companies and regional operators. For instance, Orange publishes TOS in Egypt and Jordan, but not in Tunisia and Morocco. Also, Ooredoo publishes TOS in Qatar and Oman, but not, and also Iraq, but not Algeria, Kuwait, Palestine, and Tunisia. Next slide. And this is basically the results for the access to terms of service indicator for the 2017 Corporate Accountability Index by RDR. And as we can see, Ooredoo, MTN, and Orange, which all have operators in the or have operations in the Arab region, they all get some, at least some credit for publishing terms of service. But like you have a company like MTN, which publishes its terms of service for in South Africa. It doesn't do the same in I think 3 countries in the region. I think Sudan. They have operations in Sudan, Syria, and I forgot the other country, actually, the third country. But I think MTN also doesn't. Same thing for Ooredoo and Orange. They don't publish their terms of service in all of their in all of the countries where they operate in the region. In terms of human rights commitments, basically all of the companies, all of the mobile operators do not explicitly ensure that or make a commitment to respect users' free speech and privacy rights. At least, no company gets full credit for making such a commitment, and only the subsidiaries of MTN, Orange, and Vodafone get partial scores. And this is basically thanks to the commitments they make at the group level. However, these companies at the subsidiary level, they don't even though at the group level they state that these commitments actually apply to all of their operations everywhere. They don't make these commitments at the subsidiary level, and even though I think the RDR does give credit for companies for making these commitments at the group level, I think for a region like the Arab region where there are like a lot of restrictions and human rights risks, I think we would like to see companies making these commitments at the level of their subsidiaries. And as mentioned, not a single national or regional operator made these kind of commitments. Also, Ooredoo and Etisalat in the 2017 Corporate Accountability Index, they didn't get credit for making human rights commitments. A few companies, in the region, like I think Etisalat or Ooredoo, they do refer to human rights in their CSR policies, but these are mainly references to labor rights, women's rights, so they don't explicitly mention freedom of expression and privacy. I think also Zain Jordan in their sustainability report, they do mention like a commitment to respect users' privacy rights, but this is not in a policy document because in the RDR methodology we expect companies to make these commitments in a policy document where they explicitly commit to human rights, not just like in a sustainability report. Next. In terms of transparency, transparency reporting is an uncommon practice among mobile operators in the region. Only two companies, Orange Jordan and Orange Tunisia, get credit for publishing information about government requests for user data, and this is thanks to reports published at the group level, where the Orange Group makes such information available. Even though Orange has like operations in Egypt, they don't make such information available because of local laws that prevent them from doing so. Vodafone as well doesn't make that information, even though they publish transparency reports about user data. They don't make that information available because also of local laws that prevent them from doing so in Qatar, I think. Same thing, no operator publishes data about government requests for service or content restrictions. If you go to the, and this is from the 2017 Corporate Accountability Index. So this finding is kind of consistent with what the 2017 Corporate Accountability Index found. Only transparency reporting is more common among internet companies. I mean, internet companies are ahead when it comes to revealing this kind of information, even though there are like a lot of shortcomings. But particularly when it comes to government requests for content restrictions, you can see here out of, these are 10 companies, I think, only AT&T and Telefonica get some partial credit for such, information, and you have like companies like Vodafone and Orange, they don't reveal anything about such information. And this is also from the finding from the 2017 Corporate Accountability Index about the data about third-party requests for user data. Also, only 4 companies get some credit for making such information available. Of course, Uridu and Etisalat, they don't make such information available to their users. Now this is the second part of the research. While the first part of the research, we aimed to kind of map the disclosures without kind of assessing the substance or the content. In the second part of the research, we are assessing the free speech policies and commitments of the 14 mobile operators that at least publish a terms of service document using 4 RDR indicators. And through these indicators, we actually look into more than just whether a company publishes terms of service or not. Each indicator has a few elements or like sub-indicators that we use to assess these documents or these disclosures. For instance, when it comes to the access to terms of service, there are like 3 elements to the indicator. We look into whether terms of service are easy to find and whether they are available in the languages most commonly spoken by the company's users and whether they are presented in an understandable manner. In other words, it's not enough that the company just publishes terms of service. It needs to make some effort into making it easier for users to find and understand those documents. Next slide. Our findings, only 8 actually get full credit on all of the 3 elements of this indicator. In other words, only 8 companies out of 14 actually have like TOS that are easy to find and available in the languages most commonly spoken by users and are easy to understand. However, other companies like AsiaCell, for instance, they have like subscriber rules, but they are not, for instance, they are only available in Arabic, they are not available in Kurdish, despite Kurds being the largest minority in the country. Lika Mobile Tunisia also only publishes its TOS in French. Next slide. This is a screenshot of Zain Jordan's TOS, and this is kind of the example of a document that's not easy to read at all. It's like, and this is what RTR also assesses in this indicator. I mean, companies need to make it easier for, this is very, I mean, this, I assessed this document and I read it, it was very hard to read. The layout of the document, there is no, you know, space between the different lines, and the font used is it's very small, so this is not a very good practice, you know, when it comes to you know, making it easy for users to access terms of service. The second indicator that we used assesses whether companies have like a policy or like commit to directly notify users about changes to terms of service. And this actually requires kind of companies to directly notify users and to disclose a time frame within which it provides notification before these changes come into effect, and whether they have like a public archive so that users can follow, or those interested can follow, you know, these changes and understand these changes over time. So this is an indicator where actually all companies, you know, kind of fail to either partially or fully satisfy all of the three elements of indicator F2. 6 operators get no credit at all because they simply didn't disclose a policy of directly notifying users. Because, I mean, with this indicator, it's not enough to just say that a lot of the companies, and this is very common among the operators in the region, they just say that to find out about, you know, our latest or our changes, just, you know, keep visiting our website, and that's not enough. Companies need to make a commitment to actually directly notify users, either through like an SMS text or through any other means. So this is definitely an indicator where operators in the region are not doing well. The third indicator assesses the process for terms of service enforcement. Each company has its rules, or each company needs to kind of make sure that you know, its users don't violate certain rules, and we expect companies to be, you know, sort of transparent about the types of content or activities they don't allow. And not only that, but also to be transparent about the process they use to identify, you know, content or users, you know, that violate the company's rules, and also to disclose their process of enforcing the rules, and to kind of provide, you know, some examples to show that they are making an effort that to kind of help their users understand what these rules. So sometimes, you know, some of the things I noticed doing this research is sometimes companies refer to some inappropriate, they use like the term inappropriate content, but they don't really make an effort to kind of state what may represent a content or that is deemed inappropriate, so that's not enough. Also with this indicator, companies kind of also fall short on disclosing their process. Although most companies do disclose information on the types of content or activities and the reasons why they may restrict users' access to the service. 11 companies receive actually full credit for both elements 1 and 2, but there are like some vagueness in the language used by some companies, which is also, I think, a reflection of the vagueness of some of the laws that companies need to abide by in the region. In terms of providing examples, only 2 companies do in the UAE, and Lika Mobile do provide examples to help users understand the rules. And one company reveals that it uses reveals a process it uses to identify content and users that violate their rules. It's sort of reporting mechanism that the company has in place where users can just email the company about content or users that are violating rules. And the final indicator that we use is whether a company, they do have in place grievance and remedy mechanisms to address users' freedom of expression concerns. In this indicator, we expect companies to disclose process or processes for receiving complaints, but to also be explicit that these processes include complaints related to freedom of expression. Also, they need to disclose a process for responding to these complaints and report on the number of complaints received and those complaints received related to freedom of expression, and whether the company provides clear evidence that it is responding to complaints. So with this indicator, all operators receive credit for revealing a process for receiving complaints. Only 8 operators out of 14 reveal a process for responding to complaints, but no operator discloses that this process includes complaints related to freedom of expression. So these complaints can just be like about access or about speed, but we can't know for sure that these also include complaints related to freedom of expression. And none of the 14 operators also provide evidence that they are responding to complaints. They also don't report on the number of complaints received, and I think this is also consistent with some of the findings of the Corporate Accountability Index. This is still not a very common practice. So I think that's yeah.
Great. Sum anything up or?
Well, I think what I would want to say is that this is, again, like we used only 4 indicators to assess the free speech policies because there aren't like enough disclosures anyway. But we're hoping that this would be like sort of like the beginning to try to maybe advocate like operators to try to do more, or at least focus on certain countries or certain operators so that they adopt these practices. And maybe then in the future we can use more indicators from the RDR methodology, or maybe in the future we assess the privacy policies. So yeah.
Great. Jad, should I use this one? Yeah? So thank you, Afef. Rebecca, I'm sorry that I wasn't able to get the presentation on the screen until the middle of the presentation, but hopefully you were able to follow along a little bit. So, I mean, to transition, we sort of start with the specific and the local here, looking at the research that FF has been doing over the past year. And, we started with not even knowing how many mobile operators were in the region. FF went through, we defined our region as the countries of the Arab League, since there was already a political and a linguistic commonality there. She went and identified all 66 operators in these 22 different markets, evaluated them, looked at their ownership structures, identifying which ones were owned by multinationals, some of which had been ranked in the Corporate Accountability Index, as well as some regional owners, as well as maybe some national owners. And then as you described, FF, you went and we did the disclosure inventory And then of the disclosures that we identified, this analysis according to 4 of the many more indicators of sort of what the basic needs are, and have produced this baseline report. Forthcoming baseline report. So, I mean, it would be great to understand from you, Rebecca, like, where did this, all come from? Our origin story is that it came from the Ranking Digital Rights Project, but this idea of sort of ranking and evaluating companies, why is it necessary? How have you been doing it, and how are you seeing it localized in other regions? Sorry, can you say that one more time?
Can you hear me? I just want to make sure you can hear me before I...
Yes, we can hear you now. I'm going to also put a microphone so that we record your voice. Yeah. Great. Chad,
Wonderful. And I might also try to share my screen, and I may or may not succeed.
Okay.
But to kind of talk a little bit about why we're doing this, first of all. It really came from a number of places. One is that I actually originally knew Afef through working on Global Voices, which is an international citizen media community, and of course people who are creating, people who are blogging, people who are reporting online, people who are using the internet for activism, people who are just trying to use the internet and to have conversations about how their society can improve, or to inform one another of what is happening in each other's communities. There are obvious threats that people are experiencing related to censorship, related to surveillance, related to kind of attack and security. Are you still hearing me okay?
Yeah, we can hear you perfectly.
Okay, wonderful, just checking. And so the idea for the forms, etc. And so it's really important that we understand how the companies are interacting with governments when it comes to either controlling people's content or controlling people's access, and what they're doing themselves, what kind of rules they've got in place themselves and how they're enforcing them. So we understand who's exercising power over our ability to communicate, and who we need to hold accountable. In what cases is it the government telling the companies to do stuff, in which case then it's sort of, we can go to the government and try and change what the government's doing, or is the company themselves enacting sort of private rules or private mechanisms? Or is it some combination of governments and companies acting in collaboration to advance their interests that might not coincide with kind of civil society's interests, and might affect people's rights? And so I was involved with, as you mentioned earlier, creating something called the Global Network Initiative that's tried to get companies to commit to principles around freedom of expression and privacy, particularly in terms of how companies handle government demands. And I think that the Global Network Initiative has made a difference in getting companies to make some baseline commitments, and the transparency reporting that's happening by Western companies, almost entirely with the exception, I would say, of a couple Korean companies, is the transparency reporting happening, I think, is in part, was originally prompted by kind of commitments to transparency that companies like Google made within the Global Network Initiative. But I felt that the Global Network Initiative, while necessary, wasn't enough. There need to be more things happening, and that not enough companies had joined the Global Network Initiative, not enough companies had made commitments, and also that the Global Network Initiative really just looks at government demands and how companies handle government demands. It's not looking at how companies are policing speech, how companies are commercially collecting and sharing our private information that can be then misused in a number of ways. So it was actually the idea of another member of the Global Voices community, an Egyptian blogger, said, well, we really need data. We need data that compares really specifically what the different companies are doing, so that we can, measure, who's doing better than whom, in what way, and so that we can push them to improve. As it happens, there are rankings. We modeled this ranking after rankings that exist in other sectors. So there are rankings that evaluate how companies treat their workers, their labor practices and their policies around labor practices. There are rankings around companies' environmental and sustainability practices. And so we kind of modeled the way in which the ranking is structured after some of these other rankings in other sectors, so that companies will be familiar with what we're doing, and will kind of understand what they need to do to change, that it'll look structurally like something they've seen before, even though it's looking at different issues. We also heard from some investors who said it would be useful to have this data, and so on. So that was our kind of our inspiration was that activists were telling us that having specific information about what specific companies are doing that will enable comparison would be helpful in advocacy, and we were also hearing from others that it would be useful. So I'm going to try and share my screen real quick, and then I'll kind of towards the end talk a little bit more about the localization projects like yours. So let me see if I can share. Oh, my sharing extension failed to install. Never mind. So,
Is there a link you can send?
I had a feeling that might happen. So I won't share my screen, but you can take a look at the website. It's at rankingdigitalrights.org. And then if you kind of click down to the index, it's rankingdigitalrights.org/index 2017. And you'll see that what we did is we evaluated 10 of the world's biggest telecommunications companies, and we deliberately selected companies from different parts of the world so that we'd get a broad global footprint. We also evaluated 12 internet and mobile companies. A lot of them are the big US platforms, plus so things like Apple, Facebook, Google, Microsoft, Twitter, Yahoo, et cetera. But we also did look at 2 Chinese internet companies and 2 Russian internet companies and a South Korean internet company and a South Korean mobile company, so that we had sort of a picture there. But I'll focus kind of what I'm going to say further on the telcos, since that's more relevant to the work you guys are doing. And so we had 10 telcos, just one U.S. telco, AT&T, one telco that operates across Latin America, América Móvil, then Vodafone and Orange, which have subsidiaries all over MENA and across the global south, Telefonica, which is very active across Latin America, MTN, Etisalat, Ooredoo, which need no further explanation if you're in MENA, and Bharti Airtel of India, which is also operates a lot in Africa in particular, as well as South Asia, and Axiata of Malaysia, which has some presence in the MENA region as well. And so we selected those 10 telecommunications companies because they had fairly wide global footprint, and because when you add them together, you get sort of a selection of global internet kind of coverage. And as Afef has pointed out, the commitments of the group level, the way in which these telcos tend to be structured is that you have an overarching, what we call group level company, say for instance Vodafone, and then you have these subsidiary companies that operate in different markets, and they may have, might be co-owned by other local companies and so on, and they have their own management, and they have their own contracts with the local government in terms of what they're required to do in order to operate. And they tend to have different terms of service and privacy policies and so on in each market. And so what we did with our evaluation, because we couldn't compare sort of all the subsidiaries all across the world. So for Vodafone, which is headquartered in the UK, we just looked at their UK operating company. And in Orange, for Orange, the French company, we looked at their main operating company in France and the services they provide in France. And so Bharti Airtel in India, similarly, we looked at their India operating company, and MTN. We looked at their services in South Africa specifically and didn't look at their operating companies in other markets, which is why it's so important what SMEX is doing, making the comparison. And what's so important about what SMEX has highlighted and this work that Afef has done is to show that the disclosures and commitments, the policies that are enacted by the home country operating companies, as well as by the group level, are often quite different from what these companies are disclosing and what their policies are in other markets or around the MENA region and elsewhere. And so I think it's really important that this research that SMEX has been doing is exposing those discrepancies. But I would also point out, and you can see this when you go to the website for the Ranking Digital Rights, our 2017 index, you'll see that the scores, the total scores, even for these telcos, all of them got under 50%, and, Vodafone got 48% of it out of 100. So they're not doing so well. There's many things that we believe in, that sort of the community of stakeholders concerned with digital rights believe, that according to, best practices under international human rights standards that these companies should be doing, that they should be disclosing, and they're not doing these things. And in some cases it's because governments are putting up some regulatory roadblocks, but there's a lot of things they're just failing to do because nobody's pushing them to do those things. And so, Vodafone only scored 48 out of 100, and that's based on their group level evaluation as well as their home market. So if one was looking at operating companies elsewhere and scoring them in the same way, you can imagine that it's from based on what we're hearing from Afef, that would certainly be an even more disappointing picture. And Telefonica, scored 33. Orange only scored 32 out of 100. When we went through all of for the full index, we had 35 different questions we were asking, and MTN, got 15, Etisalat 8, Urdu 5. So basically they got very few points at all, and particularly. As Afef mentioned on these issues that related to just very basic things about disclosure of basic terms of service, disclosure of privacy policies. But even for when you look at the privacy indicators, when you look at the terms of service and sort of transparency reporting questions, for the major European telcos, We're seeing very inadequate transparency from the telcos about, what content is being removed, under what circumstances, and, what types of government requests they're receiving. Not revealing the actual request, but just the number of requests they're receiving for what types of content, for filtering and blocking as well. Very little transparency around government network shutdown demands, and very poor transparency around user data and how user data is handled. So even for some of the European telcos, while they are presumably doing their best to comply with European telecommunication regulation, they are not transparent with their users about what is being collected, who they're sharing it with, what information are they collecting and sharing and retaining that could be used to profile and track a user. They are not providing adequate information, even to users in their home markets, about these things. And so there's a lot of work to do, I think, globally, to push these companies to do a better job, so we understand who is exercising power over our digital lives and how do we hold them accountable. Because if there's no transparency about what's even happening, it's very difficult to have accountability. And so our recommendations for these companies is, in addition to having commitments, in addition to having clear disclosures about what the entire cycle of what's happening to users' information, they even at the kind of global level, these companies are quite weak when it comes out to carrying out risk assessments to understand the impact their operations are having on users' rights. They are not being sufficiently transparent, even to the extent that the law would permit. They're not doing everything they could be, and remedy and grievance mechanisms are poor, even for basically kind of all around the world, with the exception of a few places where the law is requiring grievance and remedy. So that's I think an interesting lesson, and also kind of poor disclosure about just the security measures that the companies are taking to protect people's data. Country, group level, the disclosure is poor, and FF's and SMEX's work is showing that it's even worse, in specific markets. And there have been a couple. There's another project that's completed but hasn't published either, being conducted in sub-Saharan Africa by Internet Sans Frontières, and they are making similar findings that the subsidiaries of Vodafone and Orange and so on have worse disclosures than home companies and group level, and there's been some pilots as well in India, and we've certainly been finding both at the local level as well as the global level that disclosure of Indian companies, again, it's going to need a lot more pushing to push these companies to disclose, and there seems to be a sort of a broad problem globally that we're seeing, both through the Corporate Accountability Index, but I think in an even more specific way through projects like yours, is that if the law is not requiring a company to do it, to do something in particular, they can't be bothered to do it. They're not going to take the initiative to do anything the law isn't forcing them to do, unless there is pressure from somewhere else. So there needs to be a consequence. So if they're not publishing their privacy policies and they're not publishing their terms of service, well, the law isn't making them do it. So there's no consequence to them if they don't publish these things. And so I guess the question for advocacy at the national level or regional level is, how do you start to create consequences for these companies that fail to communicate basic information to their users and to the broader public about how they are manipulating people's digital lives and how they are interacting with governments?
That's great. Thank you so much for that overview, Rebecca. Can you hear us now?
Yes.
Great. That was fantastic. A couple of questions popped up in my mind, specifically around the discrepancy, and I know Afef and I have talked about this a lot, but the discrepancy between the multinationals and the local companies or the subsidiaries. I think one of the things that we are told when we talk to these telecom companies about this is that, oh, well, the conditions or the threats to their employees in these markets, if they were to act outside, not outside the law, but if they were to uphold rights in contravention of the government, or that they are not doing this, what am I trying to say? That can we expect more? Because I think sometimes they push back and say, oh, well, our licensing conditions make it so that we're not able to do that. Somewhat like with the transparency reporting, where some companies are not allowed even to report on government requests. So yeah, I mean, how much do you think we can expect? And have you seen in your work with Ranking Digital Rights and with GNI, have you seen companies come around? So
I think it's interesting. I mean, this is where I think having very specific research and kind of specific detail really helps break this down, because I think, the company's reaction, there's some truth to it, but not 100%, right? So on some things, like being transparent about government surveillance requests, in many, in perhaps most countries, that may be hard to expect. But when it comes to transparency about consumer data collection, so even, we kind of conduct what's called a jurisdictional analysis around our results. And we actually go through and we say, okay, for this thing, the law would have to change before the company could change it. But then for this thing, the company could actually do this thing even if the law doesn't change. And so I think what's important in going to companies is rather, I think one of the frustrations is that when you go to companies and you say, you need to do a lot more to respect users' rights to free expression and privacy, and the companies say, well, what do you expect? I'm in Saudi Arabia. I mean, come on, right? and then kind of end of conversation. But if you break it down really specifically, and indicator by indicator, and you say, well, actually, on this thing, I'm not finding any law that says you can't do this. And so maybe that thing you can't do, but why can't you do this thing? And you get into kind of much more specific conversations, much more concrete conversations. Why can't you report on private requests? Why can't you report about your terms of service? Okay, maybe you can't report legally on government requests, but why can't you report on copyright takedowns? Or, is it illegal to publish your terms of service? Is it illegal to publish your privacy policies? Why can't you even do that? Like, what's the, are your people going to go to jail if you publish your privacy policies? So when you break it down really specifically, again, it's sort of like, the world isn't going to be transformed by one small change, but the changes add up over time in terms of people gaining a better understanding of what companies are doing. Even one thing that's really interesting is that even at the bottom of our index, we have 2 Chinese companies. And we're seeing improvements. We're not seeing improvements in the areas where it would be unrealistic to see improvements politically in China. And it's not like Baidu is going to jump to the top of the index, but we are seeing some improvements on specific issues related to consumer privacy, even related to terms of service enforcement that doesn't involve government requests, because there's no legal obstacle actually to improving some of those things. So I guess the point is that even in the toughest places, there are areas. And then I guess the other point is that in the areas where kind of policy or law is not, I think that provides a very helpful conversation. And again, it depends on the country.
Right.
It depends on all kinds of factors. But in cases where you can identify very specifically, okay, law is preventing the company from doing, let's say from sharing, from reporting on, requests it gets to take down content for defamation claims. Okay. And the law is preventing the company from reporting this. And then you can start a conversation with policy, with legislators in that country or in some countries. What is the national security threat? What is the public interest in preventing companies from reporting these things? And ask the lawmakers to explain why they are trying to obscure this information, or why the law is obscuring this information, and why they won't change it. Because sometimes the law is just bad because nobody's been thinking about it very clearly. And so in other cases, the law is bad because it's deliberately bad. Right. But there's a whole range of things where the law is kind of preventing better disclosure for no particularly good reason. Once you really kind of sit down and have a conversation about it. It's just kind of anti-transparency by default.
Right. That's exactly what I was thinking. There's not a culture of transparency and openness, which is just sort of, it's just because that's the way we've always done it. We've never given that much information, which sort of, one of the things that I think we learned, like I was, re-looking at the findings, a lot of it seems like it's a matter of education. Of the companies as well. I mean, there was the one company, in the Emirates that was actually doing really well in terms of the processes, compared to at least relative to the others. And it sort of dawned on me as we were, editing the report that, probably in this region, one of the better ways of going about things would be to highlight the ones who are doing things well and setting those as a benchmark for the other companies.
Who are doing certain things.
Because if well. They can do it, why can't the others? Right.
Exactly. And then the other interesting thing that we noticed, and I'd like to hear your ideas, Afef, on how you think this data could be used. But one of the other things that we noticed, and we discussed just before the call, actually, or before the event, is that 8 of the 14 companies that do publish terms of service are actually based in the Gulf, in what we would think of in some contexts as the more repressive part of the region. And Afef's point is that because you have stronger telecom regulatory authorities in the Gulf. And so, these are also sort of interesting insights that we never would have really been able to correlate or even to have theories about without having done this research. And it provides a lot of, opens new pathways for further research as we sort of go down the road.
I mean, I think it highlights the role that regulators, could be playing in all of this, and the thing about, as Jessica mentioned, you think of, we're not saying here that, operators in Gulf countries or regulators in Gulf countries are, doing well for like human rights. We're totally not saying that, because if you look at some of the practices or like policies of these regulators, they are actually infringing on human rights. But we are saying that strong and independent regulators are actually would actually be. This is like a bit of tricky, because it's also kind of a bit hard to highlight or like to decide whether a regulator is independent or not. But I think it's very important that we need like strong regulators and independent regulators, in the sense that they are there to protect users' rights. And I know that some of the regulators in the Gulf countries, they are there to protect users' rights, but not explicitly when it comes to freedom of expression and privacy rights. It's still more or less about access, about access to good services and good quality services. So I think the challenge is how to move that conversation from focusing only on access to actually include human rights and freedom of expression and privacy. And I think it will be interesting in the future, or I think it will be as future research to kind of look more into the role of the regulators in the Arab region. I think that's something that we, because I think maybe in certain countries we can use them as our allies. I mean, I don't know.
Yeah.
I mean,
I think also, the point that Rebecca, you were making about the jurisdictional analysis and the law, I think in so many cases I've found myself over the past few months, usually we're not advocating for new laws, right, around freedom of expression, but in the sense, in the realm of privacy and data protection and the kinds of, mandating that companies make things available, disclose their policies and things like that it's a safer area for sort of thinking about legislation as something that you would advocate for in order to achieve your goals. So yeah, it was another thought that I had, especially in terms of making sure, data protection is such a huge issue in the region right now. All over the world, of course, but with very few data protection laws around, and that seems like that would be a very kind of low bar, not the law itself, but in sort of getting companies to pay more attention to those issues. So, with that in mind, Rebecca, I want to be mindful it is the day before Thanksgiving, where you are right now. And we are so grateful that you would join us this kind of not well-timed event for you. I don't know if, I think we have a lot of ideas here in terms of the indicator by indicator kind of advocacy, not looking at the huge lift of sort of getting them to do everything at once, but looking at sort of these very specific asks is a really interesting sort of strategy tactic that we can think about. I'll just note that neither telecom company that operates in Lebanon discloses either or terms of service or privacy policy, which is quite interesting. Again, we don't have a strong regulator here. We've been talking to consumer rights groups about how we might raise the profile of the research and use it to sort of start some sort of advocacy campaigns around that. I think they should pay attention. They were invited tonight, but I don't think they were going to come. So, I don't know if you wanted to. If you had any sort of final notes that you'd like to add, or if you had any final notes that you'd like to add, and sort of how we can take this conversation forward to transform the work that you've done into something that's actionable. One thing that SMEX will be doing and will be designing sort of after the report is published, which we expect to be published probably not next week, but the week after, and we'll release it on all of our channels and also to Ranking Digital Rights. But one of the things that we were thinking of doing is some focus groups with users in different, well, within Lebanon first, but then maybe templating that process using the results and sort of some of the methodology and the points that we've discussed here to kind of see what resonates with people. We've talked to people in Latin America who are doing some of this, who are working. Also, EFF has the Who Has Your Back project, which is similar. It's about government data requests. They've been using sort of a simpler sort of starred ranking or scoring. But we've been talking to them about their advocacy, and one of the big differences that we've seen is that they have a much more competitive markets than we have in a lot of the markets here in the region. So when consumer choice isn't a lever that you can really pull, we have to look for some other ways of kind of trying to set the bar. And so we're thinking of doing, for our parts, from focus groups in Lebanon, talking to people about the issues, or reconstituting this presentation, and then thinking about what a strategy could be to advocate for our two telecom companies, both of which are licensed by the government, or sort of public and private. And then what do you do in a completely state-owned sort of environment? So that, those are some of the questions that we're sort of grappling with, and hoping that by doing some user research, we might be able to come up with the right messaging, the right approach to some of these campaigns. So I don't know if you had some closing thoughts, Afef, or if you did, Rebecca.
Yeah, I mean, it sounds like Ocean. And one other thing that we would love to kind of work with partners on more is kind of documenting how companies' policies and practices are actually affecting people. So, just in terms of whether it's shutdowns, whether it's, website blocking, whether it's content removal, whether it's, the sharing of data, whether it's, kind of various privacy violations, whether it's security breaches, how that's affecting people. And, if companies did things differently, how would it be different, right?
Yeah.
So that people can kind of visualize, like, how is this affecting me? And is it possible to imagine life, companies not being that way, or doing something different that would actually positively? And so that's one thing that we'd love to kind of think about with you guys and other groups in different parts of the world is how do we kind of draw the link between, okay, here's what the company is committed to doing, or here's what the company discloses, and connecting that with sort of what it means for somebody's use of the internet, and what the implications are for that user, whether they're just an ordinary user or whether they're kind of a high risk user, like an investigative journalist or member of an opposition party or LGBT or something like that. And, or just a woman in an environment where people don't want women to speak out, or something, like how the different kind of policies and practices are affecting different people. And maybe having more of those kinds of impact stories might also help as well, get people to kind of then say to the companies, you're doing this or you're not doing that, and here's why it matters to me.
That's great. We've also been talking about that here. There was a shutdown in a border town called Arcel, where it was really just the mobile internet that was shut down. And we've actually been trying to figure out how to, the internet is back on now, but how to tell the stories of what the effects were. So I think that's definitely something that we'd love to work on together. What about you, Afef? Any final thoughts?
I mean, it's a good point. I think like educating users is like so important, because that's how people, I mean, we've seen that with some of the campaigns like across the region, some of the boycott campaigns for like operators here in Saudi Arabia and like other countries. I mean, it does seem that, these kind of campaigns do have an impact. They do send a message. And again, this is usually like about prices, about like blocking of VoIP apps, but again, how to, users, when they became aware of these things, and when these things like directly impact their lives, their daily lives, that's when they are ready to take, to do something about it. And this is why it's kind of important to, again, try to talk to users and try to educate users, or not necessarily users, but like certain activists, journalists. I know that SMEX have also been trying to recruit some journalists to report on digital rights, and I think that's like a good thing, but because this is how people, learn that why this is important. So I think like storytelling, like for advocacy is like, it's really important. I mean, it's one aspect of, the one aspect that we shouldn't disregard. So
Great.
Yeah.
Fantastic. Thank you both very much for being here, for participating. We will be finalizing the editing of the report and issuing it probably, like I said, maybe not next week, but the week after, and then we'll be translating it to Arabic as well and releasing it in Arabic, which will be fantastic. So, Rebecca, thank you so much for being here. We will be editing all of this together in the next couple of days and making it available to a wider audience. Afef, I'm so glad that you could join us and piggyback off of the other event and present your research and your findings, and I know it won't be the only opportunity. So thanks so much. We look forward to pushing it forward and doing more. And happy Thanksgiving, and we'll speak to you soon.
Thanks for everything you do. You guys are fabulous.
Thank you, Rebecca. Right back at you.
Take care.
Thank you.
Take care.
Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.
Bye.